Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Mark Mirando, National Science Liaison with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and I am also the Science Coordinator for the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. And I will be your host for this afternoon's first webinar on an overview of the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative for new investigators. Before we get to the main content of our webinar, I'd like to introduce the Director of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, Dr. Carrie Castile, who would like to welcome you and make a few opening comments. Dr. Castile?
Thanks, Mark, and thank you so much for the opportunity to address the participants. So one, I want to welcome you to our new investigator training, and just to let you know how much we really appreciate and we want to recognize the importance of you as researchers, as educators, as extension educators, as well as future leaders in agriculture. And we take this very, very seriously. And again, we're excited about your interest in our NIFA programs. I do want to give special thanks and a shout out to Miss Olivia Kwong, who has done a lot of work in helping to pull this together. So thanks, Olivia, for everything that you've done. I know that we're going to have a great webinar, and a lot of that is due in large part to Olivia's efforts. So I do also want to recognize that, you know, with COVID and kind of where we are, it's put a financial strain on our universities, and you know, it's what we see is an opportunity for us to see what we can do to try and alleviate some of the strain by providing more support to you, our new investigators. I do want to let you know that we've increased our support for new investigators in AFRI for the past 2 years by making 50 new investigator grant awards in 2019 and 60 in 2020. We also have further increased our support for new investigators through a new grant opportunity, which is our new investigator seed grants that will be discussed through these AFRI webinars. I do know that you'll have an opportunity to have one-on-one discussions with our national program leaders. And I do want to encourage you to take advantage of those opportunities to meet our staff and our program leadership, to get to know them a little bit more and maybe ask them some specific questions that you might have. And then lastly, I want to encourage you to look at other NIFA programs that you might be interested in. We have a whole plethora and a profile of programs that I think that you'll be interested in learning a little bit more about. So again, I encourage you, check out our website, talk to our program folks, and again, don't let this be the last opportunity for NIFA, and hopefully continue the dialogue with us. So thank you so much. Enjoy the training, and Mark, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Carrie. We appreciate your input and your advice. Again, thank you. Okay, so we'll just get right into the webinar presentation. Share my screen, it should be up now. And so the organization of this webinar will start off with an overview of the webinar agenda for the entire week, including the brief overview of the 7 webinars that will follow after this first one. I will then move on to an overview of the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, or AFRI as we call it. And that will include the organization and structure of AFRI, and as well as a fairly detailed discussion of the grant types and project types that are available or solicited in AFRI. And we will conclude with leaving substantial time for question and answers. You can include type in questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And Olivia will be answering these questions, the ones that she's able to, online as she goes through them, and the ones that we're unable to answer in the Q&A box with typed answers we will answer verbally at the end of this webinar. So this webinar series kicks off, of course, with this current webinar at 1 o'clock Central Time, and it will be an overview of new investigator opportunities in the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. Later this afternoon, beginning at 3 o'clock Central Time, there will be an overview of the AFRI Food Safety, Nutrition, and Health Program area. Tomorrow afternoon, there will again be 2 webinars. The first one at 1 o'clock will be an overview of the AFRI Agriculture, Economics, and Rural Communities Program area. And at 3 o'clock will be an overview of the Animal Health and Production and Animal Products Program area. On Wednesday afternoon, we will continue the webinar series with an overview of the programs in the Education and Workforce Development RFA and program area. And then later that afternoon at 3 o'clock Central Time will be an overview of the Agriculture Systems and Technology Program area. And then we will conclude this webinar series with 2 webinars on Thursday afternoon. The first at 1 o'clock Central Time on Plant Health and Production and Plant Products Program area, and the final one at 3 o'clock Central Time that will provide an overview of the Bioenergy, Natural Resources, and Environment Program area. So these other webinars will talk in more depth about the individual program area priorities within each of these topics. So if you have not registered for one of these subsequent webinars, I would encourage you to do so. The links are still available and you can register for them right up until they begin. Okay. So I'll move on to the main body of this webinar presentation, which is an overview of the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, or AFRI. So AFRI is organized in the following fashion. It is aligned with the 6 Farm Bill priorities which authorize AFRI, the AFRI program, and the AFRI priorities that the program must address. We have then organized AFRI at NIFA into 3 requests for applications, or RFAs. So I'll be using that acronym throughout this presentation. RFA stands for Request for Applications. And these 3 RFAs are the Foundational and Applied Science RFA, the Education and Workforce Development RFA, and the Sustainable Agricultural Systems RFA. Now, the first 2 on this list, the Foundational and Applied Science RFA and the Education and Workforce Development RFA, have been published as 2-year RFAs with application submission deadlines for the current fiscal year 2021, as well as for next fiscal year in 2022. In contrast, the Sustainable Agriculture Systems RFA is released as a 1-year RFA with 1 year worth of deadlines, and it is released annually. Now, the Foundational and Applied Science RFA and the Education Workforce Development RFA opportunities are currently open. We have not come up to the deadlines yet on the programs in either of these RFAs. The Sustainable Agriculture Systems RFA is closed for this year. We're past the letter of intent deadline for most of the program, for the major program in that RFA. But regardless, you might want to keep this on your radar for future years. As new investigators, participants in this webinar may be unlikely to have currently developed the network or the wherewithal to lead programs to lead projects that would be submitted to that RFA. However, you certainly could contribute potentially as collaborators or co-project directors to projects developed by your senior colleagues at your institutions or collaborating institutions. So the Sustainable Agricultural Systems, or SAS RFA, keep that on your radar for the future. But most of the focus will be today will be on the Foundational and Applied Science RFA and programs in the Education and Workforce Development RFA that are most likely to be of interest to you. So the Foundational and Applied Science RFA has 6 program areas that are directly aligned with the Farm Bill priorities. And these Farm Bill priorities, as well as program areas, are listed here on this slide in purple. And they are plant health and production and plant products, animal health and production and animal products, food safety, nutrition and health, bioenergy, natural resources and environment, agriculture systems and technology, and agriculture economics in rural communities. And all 6 of these program areas in the Foundational RFA will be the subject of one or more of these webinars throughout the rest of the week. We also have a group of program area priorities in the Foundational and Applied Science RFA that cut across 2 or more of these 6 Farm Bill priorities. And we refer to them as cross-cutting program area priorities, and they will also be discussed in the relevant webinars, in many cases in more than one webinar later this afternoon and later this week. So quickly running through the program areas in the Foundational and Applied Science RFA, the first program area is Plant Health and Production and Plant Products. That has the 7 program area priorities listed on this screen. The first being foundational knowledge of agricultural production systems. The second being foundational knowledge of plant products. There is a program area priority on pests and beneficial species in agricultural production systems, physiology of agricultural plants, plant breeding for agricultural production, pollinator health, research and application, and the last one is conventional plant breeding for cultivar development. That is a new program that will be appearing in the RFA when it is updated either later this week or early next week, hopefully. The second program area in the RFA is that for animal health and production and animal products, which includes 5 program area priorities on animal reproduction, animal nutrition, growth and lactation, welfare and well-being of agricultural animals, diseases of agricultural animals, and animal breeding and functional annotation of genomes. The third program area in the Foundational and Applied Science RFA is that for food safety, nutrition, and health. And it includes 5 program area priorities on food safety and defense, novel foods and innovative manufacturing technologies, diet, nutrition, and the prevention of chronic diseases, food and human health, and finally, mitigating antimicrobial resistance across the food chain. The fourth program area is bioenergy, natural resources, and environment. That includes 4 program areas. The first on soil health, the second on water quantity and quality, the third on sustainable bioeconomy through bio-based products, and a fourth program area priority on sustainable agro ecosystems, health, functions, processes, and management. The fifth program area in the Foundational and Applied Science RFA is that for agricultural systems and technology. That includes the 3 program areas shown on this screen. engineering for agricultural production systems, bioprocessing and bioengineering, nanotechnology for agriculture and food systems is the third one. And the final program area listed in the Foundational and Applied Science RFA is the Agriculture, Economics, and Rural Communities program area. It includes 4 program area priorities, one on small farms and small and medium-sized farms, a second on economics, markets, and trade, a third on economic and social implications of food and agricultural technologies, and a 4th program area priority on rural economic development. As I indicated previously, we do have a group of cross-cutting program area priorities. All 5 of these program area priorities listed on this screen cut across 2 or more of the Farm Bill priorities. In many cases, they cut across all 6 Farm Bill priorities. So the first of these is agricultural microbiomes in plant systems and natural resources. The second is the Critical Agriculture Research and Extension Program, or CARE program. We also have a program area priority on data science for food and agricultural systems. A 4th program area priority is interdisciplinary engagement in animal systems, or the IDEAS program. And finally, there is one on tactical sciences for agricultural biosecurity. And so all of these cross-cutting programs will also be discussed in the webinars coming later this week in the relevant webinars for which they apply. So briefly touch on the education and workforce development request for application. So as new investigators, some of these programs may not be directly applicable to you, but you may have students and postdoctoral trainees that you may want to have look at this RFA and these programs and consider applying. So the first 3 programs on the next 2 slides, I think, are most relevant to this audience. So there are postdoctoral fellowships opportunities and predoctoral fellowship opportunities for which the individual scholar or student applies through their institution for a fellowship grant. We also have a program called Research and Extension Experiences for Undergraduates, or REEU, in which a group of faculty at an institution will apply for a grant to support a group of undergraduate fellowships. And so this may be an opportunity to support your program of undergraduate education at your institution. There are 4 other programs in the education and workforce development RFA that provide for the continuum of opportunities for education from K through 12 through the junior college and undergraduate programs up through pre and postdoctoral training that NIFA provides. So you can see we provide a continuum of opportunities from K through 12 up through new investigators and beyond. So the 4 additional programs in the education and workforce development are professional development for agricultural literacy, agricultural workforce training, food and agricultural non-formal education, and agricultural literacy and workforce development evaluation. So I briefly just want to mention the Sustainable Agricultural Systems RFA that I identified earlier in this presentation. So this is a new RFA that began in 2018, and this is represents the progression and evolution of the former challenge areas to new transdisciplinary systems level work. And in this RFA, we offer up to $10 million per grant per systems level coordinated agricultural project grant. And I'll mention later on, describe what an agricultural, a coordinated agricultural project or CAP grant is. But again, this is something you may want to keep on your radar, keep in mind for the future. So the Sustainable Agricultural Systems RFA solicits creative and visionary projects that use transdisciplinary approaches and integrate research, education, and extension to promote convergence of science and technology, to solve present and future challenges to the food and agricultural production system, and result in tangible benefits to society. So that represents all three of the RFAs and the contents for these AFRI RFAs. So now I'd like to shift gears a little and talk about the different grant types that are available in the AFRI program. So this slide generally lists an overview of the different grant types that are available. We have standard grants, which are the most common type of grant that we offer in AFRI. And standard grants are offered in essentially every program area priority within the foundational RFA. We also offer coordinated agricultural projects or CAP grants. These are large multi-million-dollar, multi-investigator, multi-institutional grants, and they are primarily in the Sustainable Ag Systems RFA, although there may be an opportunity in one or two program area priorities in one of the other RFAs. We solicit for conference grants to support scientific conferences, symposia, and workshops as well. And then we have a suite of grant types listed under the Food and Agriculture Science Enhancement as grants or FASE grants. And this latter group of grants are capacity building grants to strengthen specific areas in the food and agricultural sciences. So there are three components to our FASE grant opportunities, and they are listed in green at the bottom of this slide. So we have the first of the three components are the new investigator grants. And there are two types of new investigator grants that I will discuss later in this presentation. We have several types of strengthening grants. And then finally, the third component are the pre and postdoctoral fellowship grants. And again, these are all capacity building of one sort or another. And they all have a little bit of different eligibility, and I'll talk about the eligibility and the grant types subsequently. So the goals of the FASE grants are to help institutions develop competitive projects and to attract new scientists and educators into careers in high priority areas of national need in the food and agricultural sciences. So those are the overarching goals of the FASE grants. So as I mentioned previously, 2 slides ago, we have these 3 components of the FASE grants and new investigator grants, the strengthening grants, and the pre and postdoctoral fellowships. There's 2 types of new investigator grants, a suite of strengthening grants, and then of course the pre-doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships. So the eligibility for new investigator grants is that the project director must be in the first 5 years of their first career track position. And a career track position is one in which the individual is according to their institution, is allowed to submit a regular grant application as project director, and then to hold and be responsible for that grant application, that grant, if awarded, as project director. So it's not necessarily 5 years from when the doctoral degree is received. It can be later than 5 years if a person has gone and done a postdoctoral position before getting their first career track position. So the clock, the 5-year clock, begins with the beginning of the first career track position. These individuals must have a limited publication record and a history of no previous federal funding, competitive grant funding as project director, other than a pre or postdoctoral fellowship or AFRI seed grant. So this applies to them, what they've received as project director, not as co-project director, but as project director. That's the only thing we're looking at for eligibility. These new investigator grants are offered only within program area priorities of the Foundational and Applied Science RFA. So there's 2 types of new investigator grants. The first type are new investigator standard grants. And these grants are standard grants in all respects, except they're submitted by a new investigator. They're submitted to the program area priority of interest. They're reviewed with and evaluated with all the other standard grants submitted to the program area priority, but there is separate and special consideration for funding as submissions from new investigators. The project type, budget restrictions, page limits, project duration are the same as for all the other standard grants in that program area priority. So when applying for a new investigator standard grant, the project director should check the new investigator box on the AFRI project type form. That's a required form in the AFRI application kit. The second type of new investigator grant are new investigator seed grants. And these are brand new. As Dr. Castile has said earlier, this is a new opportunity for new investigators. So we've previously have had seed grants, but these are seed grants now for new investigators. And the goal or the purpose of these is so that new investigators can obtain preliminary data to support a subsequent standard grant application to the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative. Again, like the new investigator standard grant, they are submitted directly to the program area priority of interest. The budget limit for these grants for seed grants of all types, new investigator seed grants and strengthening seed grants that I will mention later, is $300,000 in total costs for 2 years of support. When applying for a new investigator seed grant, the project director should check both the new investigator and seed grant boxes on the AFRI project type form. So that covers the new investigator grants opportunities. So as I mentioned, there's a suite of strengthening grants, and new investigators may also be eligible for these as well. So the project director eligibility for all of our strengthening grants are that the project director must be located at a degree granting institution that are either in an EPSCoR state or an EPSCoR entity. And what I mean by an entity are those possessions and territories that are not states. So for example, the District of Columbia, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Northern Marianas Islands are all eligible for strengthening grants under the EPSCoR program. There are also 19 states that are eligible under the EPSCoR program. So if an institution is in one of these states or one of these entities, they are eligible. Alternatively, they can be, if they're not in these EPSCoR states or EPSCoR entities, they can be small to mid-size institutions that are not among the most successful. And when we say small to mid-size, our cap is for this is above 17,500 students. So if total enrollment is 17,500 or fewer students, then it's classified as small to mid-size. Not among the most successful means that your institution is not listed on our table in the RFA that lists the most successful institutions, and that is table 1 in the RFA. Or they can be in minorities. You can be located at minority serving institutions that again are not among the most successful, and the AFRI definition of minority serving is one with greater than 50% total enrollment of all minority groups. So if an institution falls into one of these categories, doesn't have to be all three, just one of them, then they're eligible then project directors are eligible for strengthening grants under the strengthening program. So as I mentioned at least twice previously, we have several different types of strengthening grants. The first three are strengthening standard grants, strengthening cap grants, strengthening conference grants. These are identical in all respects to the respective standard grants, cap grants, and conference grants that are offered. The only difference is institutional eligibility. And so if you apply for a strengthening grant, you compete with all the other grants of that type in the program. And if an application is not successful, it can then compete for a separate set aside of funds that are available to the strengthening grant applicants. There are three other types of grants: the seed, sabbatical, and equipment grants that are unique. These grant types are unique to the FASE program. That is the seed grants. We have strengthening seed grants and new investigator seed grants. And then we have two types of grants, sabbatical and equipment, that are strengthening only. So for these latter two types, you need to be in one of those categories. Your institution needs to be in one of those categories listed on the previous page. And then, of course, the final of the three components in the FASE grant, among the FASE grants, are the pre- and postdoctoral fellowships. The project director eligibility is restricted. These are restricted to citizens, nationals, and permanent residents of the United States. Both of these grant types, fellowship grant types, have a second criterion. For pre-doctoral fellowships, it includes progress towards the degree. And for postdoctoral fellowships, the second criterion is time since completion of the doctoral degree. And both of these are a little complex. And so I'm just going to refer you to the RFA and suggest that you look at the RFA for a clear definition of these, indication of these additional criteria. And as I indicated previously, these may not be very relevant to you in terms of applying directly, but you may have pre-doctoral students or postdoctoral scholars that you would like to apply for these programs. And of course, there's two types of fellowships: the pre- and postdoctoral fellowships as I've said, similar programs. These are both offered in the Education and Workforce Development RFA. They are individual specific program area priorities. For these programs, institutional eligibility is not restricted to degree granting institutions. And postdoctoral scholars can apply, for example, if they are listed, if they are being trained at federal laboratories or for-profit companies or private foundations. So now I've covered the grant types, and I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about the project types. And so there's a little bit of this can be a little bit confusing because project types and grant types are not the same thing. So project types, when we talk about project types in AFRI, we're referring to the type or the function of the agricultural knowledge system that the project is addressing, whether it's research or education or extension or a combination of these three. That is a project type. Whereas under these project types, we have standard grants, cap grants, conference grants, and so forth. So there's two general classes of project types we have in AFRI. The first we broadly refer to as single function projects, and these will be research only projects or education only projects or extension only projects. So in the foundational and applied science RFA, we have mostly research projects, not only research projects, but most programs offer research projects or solicit for research projects. Whereas in the Education and Workforce Development RFA, we have a few programs that offer education only single function projects. Not exclusively, but we do have some programs there. So for single function projects, the eligibility is very broad. We accept almost all entities in the US are eligible to submit for single function projects. The second broad category of project type is an integrated project type. So integrated research, education, and or extension. So an integrated project is one that combines at least two of these three functions of the agricultural knowledge system. In some cases, they may be required to include all three of them. And it includes those functions and integrates them in a meaningful way so that they are interdependent components of the project. For integrated projects, eligibility is restricted to colleges and universities within the US as per statutory requirements in the within the Farm Bill authorization for the AFRI program. So eligibility is restricted for colleges and universities, including as listed on our website and in the RFA, the 1994 land grant universities, Hispanic serving universities, private colleges, land grant 1890s and 1862 land grant universities, private and all private and public colleges and universities within the United States. So, as a final word of advice and caution in looking through the RFAs and getting ready to apply, each program area priority in each RFA will clearly specify the grant types that that program area priority requests, as well as the project type that it requests. And in many cases, these will be limited by the program area priority. So only applications that are specifically requested that include the grant type and project type that are specifically requested will be considered for evaluation. So you need to look at these in the RFAs and carefully monitor the, carefully determine the grant type requested in your program area priority of interest and the project type requested. So after you've read through the request for applications very carefully and have found the programs that you intend to apply, for which you intend to apply, I will direct you to these frequently asked questions web pages that we have on our website. And Olivia Kwong has done a marvelous job assembling these web pages. Excuse me. And they are very user-friendly. They start with a table of contents for each, so you can quickly find out where your question or type of question may reside and get to it very quickly. And so we have one developed specifically for new investigators. We have one that's general FAQs that cut across AFRI, and then we have one for FASE grants. Okay, so what happens if after you've read the RFA and looked through the FAQs, you still cannot find the answer to your questions? So if that's the case, I strongly encourage you to contact the program staff with your questions. All of the RFAs list program contacts and their contact information under each program area priority. So we do that so you can reach out to us with your questions. The foundational RFA will be updated very soon with new program contacts for the new program leaders that we've hired within the agency. But you're welcome to contact us before the revised RFA is posted. And I'd strongly encourage you to contact program staff if you have questions. This is a very important part of our job as program leaders and science liaisons, and we take it very seriously, and we think we do an excellent job of providing this customer service to our applicants and stakeholders. So I encourage you to contact the program staff. So with that, I will conclude this webinar presentation, and we will open it up to Q&A and try to answer as many of those as we can. We have over 45 minutes remaining in this 1.5 hour webinar. So we will just open it up. Shelby?
Yep, it looks like Olivia has done a great job answering some by chat. So if you did ask a question, you can look at the Q&A and see if she typed an answer back. And I'll start reading from the top. So the first question is, several institutions have given a 1-year extension for tenure applications and many other things due to COVID. Will AFRI extend the 5-year limit to classify new investigators?
That's an excellent question, and one that we have not really considered. So this is in the federal legislation, and at this time we don't really have any authorization to extend this beyond the 5-year limit. You may have had a challenge continuing your program at your institution during COVID, but you still have the opportunity to apply for grant applications. So until we get additional guidance, I would say the answer to that is likely not.
The next question is specific to plant biotic interactions. Since it's jointly done with National Science Foundation, is that something that a new investigator can apply to as a new investigator with the special funding opportunities?
So Ann Litchens Park is a program leader that oversees that, and she will be discussing that program on Thursday, I believe. And so that would be best asked for her. I do not believe that that there will be a box to check, because you would be applying to NSF and they do not use the exact same forms. But Anne would then have the option to look through those grants that or the competitive grant applications, and try to make those some awards to new investigators. So that's something we try to do, whether you check the correct box or not. But again, I'm going to recommend that you ask that question directly to Ann Litchens Park, either in the webinar or sending her an email directly about how that would be handled.
The next question is it possible to apply for both a standard grant as a new investigator and for a seed grant to the same program area with the same deadline with two different proposals?
So we have no restriction on that. So we can't keep you from submitting two grant proposals to the same program as a standard grant and a seed grant. You are not allowed to submit two seed grants, so we do have that restriction in there. But I would discourage you from submitting two grant proposals to the same program at the same time. Submitting grant proposals, this is not like playing the lottery, where the more chances you play, the more likely you are to win. If the more grants you submit, the less likely you are to win, because you will be splitting your time between preparation of the two grant applications. And so what you'll end up doing is having two grant proposals that are moderately well crafted, instead of one grant proposal that is very well crafted. And I can tell you, if you're a new investigator, it takes a lot longer to put together something that is reasonably competitive than you think it does. So that would be my advice. Focus on one and work really hard on getting that into the outstanding category.
And then there's a series of several questions that are all pretty similar here, asking about what is considered the limit record for publication to be considered a new investigator.
That's a good question. So we don't really have an actual numeric limit. So those criteria that we've included in our RFA and that I listed on the slide, they came almost verbatim out of the Farm Bill authorization and statutory requirement for supporting new investigators. So that's one of those things that falls in a gray area. I would say, you know, we've had questions where people have spent 10 or more years in postdoctoral positions. And so their publication record is starting to get pretty substantial in the 15 to 20 publications. And so that's when we would exclude them from new investigator status.
And then a similar question, does industry experience have any impact on new investigator eligibility if other criteria are met?
So if you are in an industry setting where you're allowed to publish and submit grant proposals, then that would be likely counted against your new investigator clock. Many industry positions will be in the form of consulting or sales, and so there would not be a research component. So that would probably not be applicable to counting against your new investigator status. But other industry positions do allow for research. What we're really focused here on the new investigator program is new investigators that meet the criteria, but we're really looking at early career scientists. So individuals that have relatively recently finished up their doctoral work, regardless of what age they finished that up at. But we're not really looking to count individuals that are 10 to 15 years past their doctoral training as new investigators, because they have gained additional experience and savvy and education beyond and training beyond the doctoral program.
And then we have two questions that are slightly similar, so I'm going to ask them together. Will being a PI in a planning grant for SCRI disqualify someone? And then do SARE grants fall under federal funding as a PD for new investigator?
So those are good questions. So the first one is a PI on an SBIR, is that right?
SCRI.
Okay, so the definition we have is a you can have no competitive grant funding as project director other than a pre or postdoctoral fellowship from us or any agency, or an AFRI seed grant. So any other competitive grant funding from the federal government would disqualify you, your eligibility as a new investigator. For a SARE grant, they're really it's technically, it comes from the federal government, but it's issued through the states. So I think we would look at those, individual grants for the size and magnitude, because they're not really very substantial, and they are actually, I believe, would be technically made as a sub-award through the SARE program.
A few more questions about eligibility. If my university will allow me to submit a proposal as a principal investigator, though I'm a PhD and research associate with a university center, then am I eligible? So this one, it sounds like they're a research associate. And then the next one is, if my university allows postdocs to be PDs, is it possible to submit one as a postdoc for the new investigator grant?
Right, so those are both related. So if your institution allows you to submit a competitive grant to us as a project director for a program in the foundational RFA, for example, then you can submit as a new investigator. But keep in mind that once you submit as a new investigator, then your clock is going to start. So you can't stop the clock because later on and then restart it because later on you get a faculty position or a position at a federal lab and you want to restart it then. But you are eligible now to submit a grant as a new investigator. That restriction is, so we have this eligibility restrictions and requirements, and then from there, the restrictions would then be at your institutional level as to whether they allow you to submit.
Okay, and then the next question is, can funding for new investigator C grant be used for purchase and installation of structures such as high tunnels?
So that would probably be categorized as equipment because it would be removable. I would consider a high tunnel an equipment, just like a tractor or a plow or piece of laboratory equipment. And so if it's specialized equipment needed for the grant, then we generally allow it in our grants, and it should be permissible.
The next question is, why does federal funding from another agency disqualify someone from being an AFRI new investigator?
Because we are trying to so there's two parts to that answer. First, the simple and most direct answer is that's what's in the Farm Bill authorization and legislation. So it is a legal restriction. But the purpose of that legal restriction is to try and give people that have not yet been successful in securing federal grant funding greater opportunity or increase their success rate. So that is really the purpose. We recognize that you may have received competitive grant funding from another agency, and that eliminates your eligibility, assuming it wasn't a pre-doctoral or postdoctoral fellowship. But we're really trying to advance the careers and the success of those that have not yet received federal grant funding. So again, this goes back to what I said several times, that these are capacity building. So somebody that has already received a grant from NIH or NSF or Department of Energy as a project director, they don't need as much assistance as somebody who's in their first and second year as a new investigator and has not yet received a competitive grant. Thank you. These are all great questions, by the way.
Yeah, I think that you're getting some tough ones, Mark. The next question.
Some ones that we haven't, we're getting some questions that I have not encountered in my previous 20 years with NIFA. So keep going.
Can DVM students apply for a pre-doctoral fellowship to conduct PhD studies? I'm not sure what DVM means. Maybe doctor of veterinary medicine?
Yeah, DVM is a doctor of veterinary medicine. And so the program says pre-doctoral. So the doctoral degree does not have to be a PhD. It can be a doctoral degree of another type, whether that's a DVM or an MD or an ED or a JD. So any doctorate, the RFA, I do not believe that specifies the type of doctorate. So I believe you can pursue, apply for a pre-doctoral fellowship. But I would encourage you to register for the Education Workforce Development and ask that question then, or let me put it that way, send that question directly to the program contact in the Education Workforce Development. But I'm fairly certain that the answer to that is you can apply for that if you're in a DVM program.
The next question is, it came up during your slide with the types and eligibility. Can you please explain the types and eligibility as it relates to single function and integrated research? I think they're kind of getting at who's eligible if it's single function versus.
Okay, if it's any of the single function types of grants, so if it says research only, or if it says education only, or if it says extension only, it'll generally have one of those three phrases under project type. Generally, we don't say single function in the RFAs. We'll say research only, education only, or extension only, or might list two of those. So if it's one of those types, any one of those types, almost anyone within the United States is eligible to apply, from academic institutions through for-profit companies, whether they are large businesses or small businesses, private foundations, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, even private individuals are eligible to apply. There are very few exceptions to that eligibility. The only one I've encountered within the US is state laboratories, surprisingly. So that's for any of the three single function types. For integrated, it is colleges and universities. So if the project director is not located at a college or university, is not applying through the college or university, then they are not eligible. And so this, to be clear again on this, this is a statutory requirement in the Farm Bill authorization for the program. It's not a restriction that NIFA has placed on this.
Another question, are there any examples of successful proposals available for new investigators to review?
So we do not, at NIFA, we do not make proposals available to individuals for a variety of reasons that I don't need to go into here. I would encourage you to reach out to individuals at your institution or your former institutions, you know, your mentoring committees, and reach out to those individuals and ask them if you can, if they would be willing to share a successful proposal with you. And I'm sure they will. So in my previous life as a faculty member at Washington State University, I used to co-teach, lead and co-teach a graduate level course in advanced reproduction. and we required our students to write a grant proposal, and I provided copies of my successful grant proposals, and the other faculty co-teaching that course with me also provided their successful grant proposals. So I think certainly within your institution or your former mentoring committee, I think they will be very generous in providing grant proposals, and I would that were successful in securing funding, and I would suggest that you reach out to those individuals.
Next question is related to EPSCoR eligibility. Is eligibility only restricted to current researchers from the listed states in this website? And they're linking the AFRI FASE EPSCoR program website.
So it should be, I would go make sure you're going through the RFA. So we have a web page that talks about the EPSCoR program, and that should be up to date. But the most reliable information is to go through the RFA, and that will have a link directly to the grant types document, and that would be the best source. So it is only the current year. So every year we recalculate the EPSCoR states, and so each year some states graduate from the EPSCoR list and some states come on to the EPSCoR list. And so for 2021, we have a new list. I do believe that we recently double-checked that web page. Olivia can probably address that because we were discussing that just a couple weeks ago. But the best place to always look is the request for application, because what's in the request for application is what we follow. What is on websites is not, we don't have to necessarily follow that information, although we try to make sure it's accurate and consistent with what's in our RFA. The RFA always supersedes what's on websites.
The next question is about eligibility as well. Will I be considered a new investigator if I previously received USDA funds as a co-project investigator?
Right, so the eligibility only applies to grant funding you received as director. So if you've been on somebody else's grants as co-project director or collaborator, that does not count against your eligibility requirement. And in our eligibility in our grant types documents in the RFA, we've tried to emphasize that it only provides to funding, it only considers funding you've received as project director and not as co-project director. We don't want to restrict you from being a collaborator or a co-project director on the grants of others by eliminating your eligibility as a new investigator because you've been a co-project director or a collaborator on somebody else's grant.
I have two related questions about the need for preliminary data for seed grants. Do you need preliminary data when applying to a seed grant? And then is there an expectation to have some preliminary data before applying, or ideas alone sufficient for application/funding? And this is specific for seed grants.
Okay, so, and that's another great question, as all of them have been. So no, the main purpose of a seed grant is to be able to acquire preliminary data, to do studies that will allow you to collect and acquire the preliminary data that will then support a subsequent standard grant application into the AFRI program. So you do not need preliminary data. Having said that, it almost certainly you need evidence that you have a program up and running, or that you have a program that's up and running, whether that's laboratory or field, and that you, once you get a grant, a seed grant, that you can start the work. But having preliminary data that you need to include in your proposal to support that it's a good idea, you do not need that data.
Another question is, what's the typical success rate of new investigator standard grants and seed grants? How, on average, for each grant type, roughly how many grants are typically awarded versus number of applications? So this is probably a tough one.
Yeah, well, I can answer that because I've looked at the data recently. So the answer for the new investigator seed grants is we don't have any data yet. This is the first year, so we have not made any new investigator seed grants outside of the strengthening, outside of strengthening grants that may have been strengthening seed grants that may have been submitted by new investigators. So it's the first year of the program. We'll know more about it in the future, but the purpose of launching that program was to provide an opportunity to provide more success to seed grants or to new investigators. So for the new investigator standard grants, across all of the program area priorities in the foundational RFA, those 6 program area priorities that I listed, and the cross-cutting program area priorities, they are averaging about 25% success rate. That's on average across all 6 and the cross-cutting programs. But, and they vary from program area priority to program area priority by quite a bit. So, but I can say that in the past year, they are on par or above those for the standard grants submitted by more experienced investigators. So that's what Dr. Castile was referring to, that we've made progress in supporting new investigators. And not only did we make 60 new investigator standard grants this past year and 50 the year before, but those are now on par or exceeding the success rates of the standard grants from more senior colleagues.
Okay, next question. Can a person with a PhD that runs a US startup company that is a US citizen be a project director?
Yeah.
And then a similar question that follows that is, can young investigators in ARS apply for seed grants and standard grants and use the new investigator checkbox?
So the answer to both of those are yes, or is yes. So startup company, any type of company is eligible for AFRI, and so a person can submit to AFRI for the grant types that we offer. They cannot submit from a company for an integrated project grant. So it would have to be a single function research, single function education, or single function extension. But are eligible to submit for AFRI for others. The second question was, can a new investigator from ARS apply? they can apply for new investigator grants. So a new investigator standard grant, a new investigator seed grant. They're not eligible to apply for a strengthening seed grant because strengthening seed grants are restricted to degree granting institutions. So they can apply for a new investigator seed grant, but they can't apply for a strengthening seed grant, which means that once their new investigator eligibility expires, they can no longer apply for a seed grant. But until then, they can apply for a new investigator seed grant, as well as a new investigator standard grant.
The next question, if I submitted last month an application to a CDFA, CSRP, I'm not sure what that is, but let's say if they applied to other source of federal funding and they're not going to know if they get funded until next November, are they still eligible to apply as a new investigator?
Yes, you are eligible to apply as a new investigator, and you should include any pending applications on your current and pending support form. This is a required document that we ask you to include in grant applications to NIFA. And so you would list the pending application that you submitted to any other agency, whether it's another USDA agency or another federal agency, or even private organization. So you would list that, your project would be reviewed, and if it was successful and it was to be awarded, then we would find out whether you got another new investigator grant or another grant before. So we would ask you about or look into, we actually have the ability to communicate with other federal agencies and find this information out. So yes, you're still eligible. It's eligibility, again, is grant funding received as project director. So if you've received grant funding, federal competitive grant funding as project director, other than an AFRI seed grant, other than a pre or postdoctoral fellowship, then you are not eligible. If you have not received competitive grant funding, federal competitive grant funding, you are still eligible even if you have multiple grant applications submitted and pending. Pending applications do not have any bearing on eligibility for new investigator grants, is another way of saying it.
Another good question that is popping up is reaching out to program officers can be very intimidating as a new PI. Can you please provide specifics on how to approach program officers? Should specific materials be prepared ahead of contact?
So we recognize that it can be a little intimidating, and so that is the reason for my final slide in this presentation, to urge you to reach out to the program officers. And this is something that both our NIFA director and our associate director wanted to make sure we emphasized in this webinar series, that you're welcome to reach out to us. I would suggest you start out by reaching out by sending a brief email to the program officer, telling them who you are, or that should be in your signature block, but you know why you're contacting them, what program, most importantly, what program you're thinking about applying to, and what grant type, and a little bit about your project. And when I say a little bit, I mean 3 or 4, maybe a half a dozen sentences at most. Most of us are experts in the fields, in the programs that we're running. So for me, in animal reproduction or other animal related fields, I really don't need 2 or 3 pages of information, because a lot of that's background information that I already know. So 3 or 4 sentences about what you're doing, and then ask your questions. And if the program leader needs more information, they will ask you for it. But my experience is, and I think my colleagues would say the same thing, is be more concise. Just give us a few sentences so we have an understanding and appreciation of your project, prospective project, and what you, but definitely we need to know what program area priority, include the program code, because a lot of people misstate what the program area priority is and don't get that right. And then what grant type and what deadline, that kind of information is pretty important, because it tells us how quickly, we need to respond. If you're applying for a deadline that's in 2 weeks, I want to respond almost instantaneously. On the other hand, if you're not, if you're looking at a program that has a deadline 6 months from now, and I know that, well, if I get you a response in a day or 2, you're still going to have plenty of time.
Sorry, the next question is, what is the advantage to submitting for seed grant versus just submitting as a new investigator? Is there a greater likelihood of funding? Can a new investigator AFRI proposal be dropped down to a seed grant if it does not get funded in the full proposal category?
Okay, so the advantage would be if you do not have any preliminary data to put in a standard grant, then a seed grant is the way to go. Because if you're applying for a standard new investigator standard grant and you don't have any preliminary data, then the inclusion, the quality of the preliminary data, quality and clarity of preliminary data in a standard grant is part of the review criteria that are used to evaluate. And no, the answer is that we cannot just drop a new investigator standard grant down to a seed grant consideration, because there's different page limits and budget limits. So if you submitted a standard grant application, new investigator standard grant, that was 18 pages long and for $650,000, that exceeds both the page limits and the budget limit for the seed grant. We can go the other direction, but we can't go from a standard grant down to a seed grant because the standard grants do not fit within the seed grant. We do not know what, again, we do not know what the success rates will be for the seed grants. We will be allocating additional funding to programs or expecting that that there will be some reasonable success for the seed grants, but this is an entirely new funding opportunity, and so we are plowing new ground, no pun intended, on this program.
Another question is, does the 300K limit for the seed grants include the indirect costs?
Yes, that is total costs. I think I had that on the slide. It's $300,000. So this is an increase from previous years when our budget limit for seed grants was $200,000. So it's $300,000 in total costs for 2 years of support for new investigator seed grants and for strengthening seed grants. So both seed grant types have the same budget limit of $300,000 of total costs.
Okay, next question. Do you have any advice for a new investigator who has never written a grant proposal? What resources are available to prepare for a grant proposal?
You know, my advice would be, if you're at an academic institution, look to your sponsored projects office. They will generally have resources, including they may have purchased videos and educational series for preparing for writing grant proposals. I would ask your colleagues in your department to do that as well. You know, if they have any advice for you, if they can provide you with a grant proposal as a successful grant proposal, I'd go out and search the web. There are lots of documents out there written by various individuals on writing successful grant proposals. You know, I would suggest you stick to the ones that are at .edus or educational institutions. I know our previous director at NIFA was a co-author of a grant writing manual when he was the associate director for research at the University of Maryland. There's some documents are as short as 2 pages. There are examples of recorded webinars and the grant writing seminars on the web. I know some of my grant writing seminars have been converted to PDFs and are posted throughout at various institutions throughout the countries, and some even internationally. So there's a lot of material out there. The big piece of advice I would suggest is to start as early as possible, develop your timeline that allows you to complete the project, complete the application a month early, so you can do plenty of reviewing and editing and proofreading of that.
Another question is, my standard grant was not successful last year. Can I convert it to a new investigator grant during resubmission this year?
So if you submitted a standard grant to a program that allows new investigator grants, then the program leader in all likelihood already converted it to new investigator grant. Because we don't rely solely, we ask you to check the project type form as new investigators, but even if you don't, we go through those grants and we do our own determination of whether it's a new investigator, whether you're a new investigator and eligible. But nevertheless, you should, if you're eligible for a new investigator, mark that. You know, don't think you shouldn't mark it. And, you know, if you're not eligible, we will not kick your proposal out of the program. We will just evaluate it as a standard grant application. And if you are eligible, we will evaluate it as a new investigator grant application. So the answer, the straightforward answer is yes, you can convert it simply by checking the box. But in all likelihood, we already did that for you, even though you didn't know it.
This next question is kind of similar to that, and maybe the last question. Will new investigators or new investigator seed grants be judged using the same criteria as a standard grant? Is there an advantage to submitting a grant as a new investigator?
So first off, there is an advantage to submitting as a new investigator, the grant, and that's why we ask you to mark that box. So the advantage is that first off, you are evaluated and compete with all the other standard grants if you submit a new investigator standard grant. So you're evaluated with all the other standard grants, and if you're successful, you will get funded if you're above the funding line. If you're below the funding line, then you have a special opportunity to get funded as a new investigator through that mechanism also. So there lies the advantage. You have basically 2 bites at the apple as a new investigator. The same principle holds for new investigator seed grants. You will be evaluated with all the other seed grants, which are basically strengthening seed grants. And then we will make separate considerations for both of those groups in terms of funding. There will be grants funded as new investigator seed grants, and then there will be grants funded as strengthening seed grants. So if you are a new investigator, absolutely you should check that new investigator box. But as I said in response to the previous question, even if you don't, even if you make a mistake and your institution institution makes a mistake and omits that check, we will be checking for those new investigator eligibility and the new investigator status, and we will evaluate your project, your proposal accordingly. So I think we are now past the 3:30 limit. And I think what I'd like to do is just acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Shelby, who's been reading out these questions, and Olivia, who has done a tremendous job organizing these webinars and answering the questions in the Q&A chat. And my other colleagues who have contributed to oversight and content of these webinars. And then all my colleagues at NIFA that are going to be putting on these webinars beginning in 27 minutes when we have the Food Safety, Nutrition, and Health Program Area webinar, and then continuing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon. And I would encourage you, if you have not signed up for one or more of those other webinars, to do so and to learn about those programs. And that will be the time to meet with some program leaders in your specific areas, maybe ask them more specific questions, and get encouraged once again to reach out and contact them. Thank you, and thank you all for participating, and I wish you the best of luck with your applications. Goodbye.